Jesus says, whoever loves me will keep my word. Whoever does not love me does not keep my word. Now, my question to you is this. Do you love God or do you love something else? I invite you to think back to the last time you've loved somebody, whether it's a husband, a wife, someone special in your life. Now, think about this. If you love that person, how do you show your love for that person? Is it only in words alone? Or is it something more, right? In other words, how do you prove to somebody that you truly love them? It can't just be in words. It has to be in action as well. We show kindness to those we love through various acts, right? Actions. So our action is a reflective of our feelings, and our feelings is a reflective of how we feel, whether love or hate. So to keep things simple here, I'd like to propose that keeping God's word is the same thing as keeping God's commandment. Really, if we get technical and go down to it, there are slight differences. But for this reflection here, keep God's commandment and God's word to be the same. Now, most of us know the essence of God's commandment, right? To love God and to love our neighbor. In fact, probably when we were younger and we were growing up, our parents taught us, well, love your neighbors, right? Love those around you and love God as well too, right? So from the above phrase then, love God, love our neighbor, you get this. How do you keep God's commandment? How do you keep God's word? Well, love God, love your neighbor. Pretty easy, right? Now, there's a positive way to look at this and then a negative way. We see it in the two phrases there, right? Number one is what it means to keep God's commandment. And number two, what it means to not keep God's commandment. Now, before we continue, I invite all of you to please subscribe to this channel. Now, let's talk about this. I've met many people in my life, people who say, for example, I love God, people who talk about God all the time, people who pray very often, they go to church, they read the Bible, they pray the rosary continuously, right? But keep in mind, they wear crosses as well too sometimes, external display. But whatever we show on the outside is one thing. But what about inside? What about deep within our heart, right? And how about our actions? Do our actions reflect charity? Do they reflect love? That's something important for us to think about. Because you see, saying we love God in word is one thing, but then how do we act in our own daily life, right? How do we go about our days? Where are our priorities? And based on that, reveals to us whether we love God or whether we love something else. You see, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verses 21, Jesus says, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. So how do you show love for God? By the way you act. And this is key. By the way you act towards others, this is how you show love for God. And it's not, by the way, how you act in public only, right? Because sometimes in public, it's easy for us to show our facade, our public image. But it's how we act at home, right? With our family, towards our family, our friends, etc. By that is a measure of our love. So here's the important point. You can hide your personality, right? But sooner or later, it will show itself. So again, two parts here. Number one is whoever loves God will keep his commandment, right? You got the love God and keep his word or commandment. So to fully understand, we look at God himself. You see, God keeps his word. He keeps his promise to us, right? He's very good to us. Now imagine if God says to you, I love you, but he doesn't keep his word, right? How do we feel? Well, not so good, I'm sure. So now, I know what some of you might be thinking as well. You might think and say, well, God doesn't love me. I have so much suffering, so much pain, hardship in my life. Well, that's not true. Because you see, with the crosses that God gives us in our life, it helps us to grow in holiness. Now, that's another topic for today. But here, I want to just share two important points, okay? Two important points. Number one, love God, keep His word. And number two, hate God, don't keep His word, right? Now, there's this love and hate relationship, if you will. And of course, too, as you can see, sometimes there's this middle ground, indifference, right? Feeling, not so important. But over the course of time, you'll either choose to love God or something else. Now, number one, love God, keep His word and His commandment. Well, what's God's commandment, right? It's about love. In fact, God is love. And because God is love, He invites us to love our neighbor, to keep God's word, to keep God's commandment. Pretty easy, right? And, I think we've said enough about this already, but the best way is through our action, and the action of love and charity towards the other is demonstrative of our love for God in return. And so then we move to number two. Whoever does not love me does not keep my word. Now, I think this is very interesting because sometimes I get people ask me, is it possible to not love God? And the answer is, yes, it is. Right? Where do we put God in our life? Where is He in our priority? Maybe not even part of our life. But even as we go deeper still, I ask you this. How is it possible to not love God? In other words, not only not just not love God, but maybe even hate God, right? Every time we commit sin, whenever we commit sin, we go against God, right? And we don't love Him. And so that's the perfect example. Now, if you think about it, if we really think about it, when we commit sin, we separate ourselves from God, right? It's just kind of like whenever we don't love somebody, what do? Right? We ignore them, maybe sometimes even hurt them or harm them, etc., right? Whenever we commit sin, we break ourselves deliberately from God, right? We separate ourselves from God. And so here's the key point. It gets even more interesting. So sin separates us from God, right? Not keeping His word and going the other way and sinning separates us from God. But then keep this very important point in mind. If we do not love God, we end up loving something else. Because you know what? Our human heart is meant for God, right? And if we don't fill it with God, then we're going to fill it with something else. This is really, really important. Something else can be power, can be honor, can be prestige, can be money, etc. All these things can end up becoming our gods, right? And so they become our priority in life. They become what we go after, and then we don't end up loving our God, right? So this is something very important for us to reflect upon. And so then I ask you, how do you love God and keep His commandment? Well, it's a challenge, right? Because of course we try to avoid sin, although we are sinners and, we make mistakes all the time. God shows us His love, shows us His forgiveness, shows us His mercy, right? And so the divine mercy of God is really great. And God gives us His love. He pours out His love for us on the cross, as you see here, but then in so many other ways, right? Through graces that we receive in our lives. More on that maybe another day. But my simple point is this. Please think about it. Do you love God or do you love something else? Because ultimately Jesus says, whoever loves me will keep my word. May God bless you.